Hello, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Reimbursement Insight, Anatomy of a Hospital. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenters, Valerie Rinkle, President at Valorize Consulting, Larry Vernaglia, Partner and Industry Teams Department Chair at Foley and Lardner, and Paul Holden, Partner in our Healthcare Consulting Group at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console if you would like more information. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Larry to get the presentation started. Larry?
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank everybody at Moss Adams for pulling together this wonderful program and for my friends Paul and Valerie for including me. What we're going to cover today in an hour with you this morning is a pretty ambitious agenda, but we're doing so from the orientation of thinking about the hospital and the hospital complex physically and spatially and how that interacts with regulatory issues, payment, reimbursement. So what we're going to really cover is understanding all the different parts of a hospital, including under the COVID environment, the so-called Hospital Without Walls program or opportunity. We'll think about how it impacts outpatient prospective payment system reimbursement for Medicare. We might touch on some of the developments in commercial payer as well. We'll look at ways to avoid payment reductions, ways to avoid the traps of them. Think about how you do cost reporting right in this new and complicated regime, and try to wrap up with some discussions. We'll take questions along the way. So to make sure that we to get to all of your issues, you can also ask some questions in the Q&A feature as we go. Amy, where do we go from here? Do we have an initial polling question?
We do. So our first polling question is to get a feel for the audience that we have today. So what is your organizational structure or type? A, hospital health system, B, skilled nursing, inpatient psychiatric or inpatient rehab, C, home health hospice, D, physician group, or E, other. And we'll give you a few minutes to respond. And to respond, you just click the answer next, the the button next to the answer you choose and then hit submit. And that will get it logged for you.
And Paul and Valerie, if they all click home health, we do different presentations today, right?
Well, that would be the hospital without walls option, wouldn't it be?
Could be. That's right. Well, in fact, that when we get to hospital with walls, if we have the time, we can talk about the fact that there really were lots of different ways that hospitals were already providing services to patients in their home or in communities. So in some respects, while this is a nice innovation in COVID, they didn't invent it out of whole cloth.
That's right. That's right.
And you're absolutely right about home health. Good. We get to keep our slides.
Yeah. But other, so there's got other there, so that's cool. We're going to have some, I think other's going to start to climb over the next ensuing years.
Right. Okay. Moving right along. All right, so we've covered our agenda, and we wanted to start with just sort of a graphical approach to looking at where the hospital is, and that's what we're going to do in our time together today. And probably 5 or 6 years ago, nobody ever cared so much about where the next piece of real estate would be other than whether you could afford it or whether it might meet life safety code. But now what's on campus means a lot. And we're seeing lawyers and other people out there with tape measures trying to see if the new building that we want to put here next to our facility, that green space, is going to be on campus or off campus. If it's off campus, is it an inpatient facility that we might get new treatment as a remote location? So, you know, historically there weren't that many ways that this mattered to you. It was a little easier to get status treatment on campus than off campus. There were some special rules for management contracts and joint ventures, but by and large, those were really ancillary issues. Now it's the core question, isn't it, folks? So I think, Valerie, would you take us through and put some meat on the bones about why we care about where the location of these hospitals are?
Yeah, I absolutely will. But before we do that, we have yet another polling question.
Oh, we do. You're right. Did I pass right past it? Sorry.
Yep.
All right. So the second polling question is, does your hospital or health system routinely review and assess locations for services and whether those services are provided in the optimal physical or clinical location? A, yes, B, no, or C, we will now. And just a reminder, for CPE purposes, you do need to respond to 3 of the 4 polling questions.
My bet is 50% B.
Yep. But it is absolutely one of the key tenets of what we're going to be talking about today. And it's almost where it's a baseline necessity to assess your physical locations and the status today, and then have at the ready that baseline assessment for when you start to have conversations about the need to relocate clinical services. It's
leaving aside
really a
compliance
necessity.
issues for, and leaving aside compliance issues for existing non-compliance, let alone future planning.
Exactly. And because I do a lot of work with billing departments, you know, I like to, you know, figuratively say, you know, you have every right to kind of fold your arms in front of you and say, I'm not going to release one additional claim unless we know the answers to some of these questions, because modifiers have to go on the claims and the location of service have to go on the claims, which affects the claim processing system and the setup. And answers to these questions are key. Hey, good.
Well,
68% said yes.
I'm impressed. The Moss Adams
Yep.
client base is being well served, and there you go. There's our yes.
Yep. All
so
right.
Valerie, take us into why we care.
Yeah. So why the location of the department matters? Well, because it determines the payment system, and then it determines other key components related to the definition of a hospital in terms of where you can reduce expense and what you can do, right? So the baseline threshold question is whether the physical location or address, however you want to think about it, because address matters whether it's suited or not. That's a new term, right? Do you break it down into Suite 101 or Suite A and B versus it's just one physical address, and even though that address may have 20 floors to it, right? So whether the physical location meets the criteria to be a provider-based department or not. Hospital-based is sometimes another term used.
And that's really a gating issue for so many topics for billing purposes. If you want to bill for hospital outpatient treatment services, it's got to be provider-based, whether it's outpatient prospective payment system or not. It's a gating issue for 340B, but not for everything. So not for purposes of whether you're subject to the 3-day DRG payment window, not for purposes of whether Stark might be triggered. And so, but I do think that's a great way to orient it, Valerie.
Yep. And then you also, in very little words, made a key criteria differentiation. Are there going to be outpatient therapeutic services at this location, or is it diagnostic services? Because those criteria can differ as well, whether provider-based. So then once you check the box and say, yes, this location not only meets, but we intend it to meet because we want it to be a provider-based department, then the question is whether the services at that location are going to be paid under a hospital payment system. And even if it is paid under a hospital payment system, is the payment rate or dollar amount impacted based on whether the location is defined to be on or off campus to the main provider. And the main provider is the provider that's got the inpatient beds associated with it. And we'll speak more about that in a minute. So then once you say, okay, here are the locations for which hospital payment system is in play, if you will, it's invoked, it's appropriate for the services at that location. If it's off campus, then there may be services that, even though it's payable under the hospital payment system, that still get a cut in payment by virtue of being off campus or not. And this is controversial right now. We'll speak to it. But if it's a new location and it has to be located off campus, and it's a PPS hospital, due to Section 603, and you'll learn more about that in a moment, then new locations are also in the statutory language considered to be non-accepted, which means they're no longer payable by Medicare as a hospital outpatient department. And then finally, the question, and that's that last question there, right? It's basically saying that you're forfeiting hospital payment even though you've met all the criteria to be provider-based in all other respects. You're going to have to forfeit it because it's new, or you had to relocate it for a reason other than the accepted extraordinary circumstances relocation, which Larry will talk about in a moment. So a bit of background on provider-based departments. What are the advantages? Well, because you can claim these locations on your hospital cost report, and it's payable under hospital payment system for the facility resources or hospital resources invoked in the delivery of the outpatient hospital services, there's advantages under the payment system. Larry already mentioned the 340B eligibility program, which significantly reduces your outpatient drug costs for all patients, not just Medicaid patients. You can claim bad debt and uncompensated care through the hospital payment systems. It will influence the disproportionate share and indirect medical education payment formulas, and you can include the locations in providers' third-party payer contracts, but that's a point. More and more commercial payers are trying to no longer recognize provider-based departments for outpatient, certain types of outpatient services because they no longer want to pay the hospital payment rate for them. Disadvantages. So for a single encounter with Medicare and likely Medicaid or those payers that you quote split bill, and we'll talk more about that later, the patient's going to pay two co-insurance or co-payment amounts, a co-payment amount for the facility claim, which is a UB claim, and if it's not all encounters, but if that same encounter, the clinician that is separately going to bill their professional fee was involved concurrently at that encounter, then there's going to be another coinsurance. Not all hospital outpatient department services, though, require a clinician to be concurrently present during the delivery of the service. A lot of services can just be ordered and delivered under general supervision by qualified staff. There's supervision, but it doesn't require the concurrent physician. There can be some physician dissatisfaction because part of the provider-based department rules concern governance and structure that the hospital and medical staff has to have, which is different than what they think of typically as an ambulatory or outpatient office type setting. And then this has become, as you'll hear more, an ever-evolving regulatory landscape with some pitfalls and traps, if you will. Overall, CMS's objective is that they want to make absolutely sure that when a hospital bills under the hospital payment system for payment, that the services are truly at a hospital level and not something that was more of a physician-directed clinic, freestanding setting that just a sign got slapped over the door, if you will. So they want to ensure that the hospital has licensure, maintains proper level of control, it's incorporated into the financial structure of the hospital and everything. So those criteria that we mentioned a moment ago, those are all outlined in a section of the Code of Federal Regulations at 42 CFR 413.65, and we'll talk in some aspects about that later, but key within those rules is this on versus off-campus definition. And you'll see the language there. So it's going to key off of the main buildings of a hospital campus, not solely the main building, singular, where the inpatient beds are. It's plural in the definition. And it keys off 250 yards. And it's made a determination, the citations and your attestation, if you're going to submit one about meeting the requirements, goes to the CMS regional office that you're under. So we're going to use this little graphic to help discuss this a bit. So if you look at the main hospital campus there on the left, I've got a couple of hash marks, right? And they're coming off of different points of the main buildings of the campus. And you measure with a tape measure, like Larry said, right, 250 yards out. And I think of it as a bird's eye view looking down and kind of draw a circumference or a bubble, as I like to think about it. Your 250-yard bubble that's on campus. It's literally not going to be a circle, because if you're drawing from the outermost corner of the main buildings of your campus, it's going to be odd-shaped, amoeba-shaped possibly, depending on where you're drawing the line from. And everything pretty much in that is on campus. It's protected. No modifier is needed when you bill, and it's 100% from Medicare, 100% OPPS payment. Then in the provider-based rules, you can go up to 35 miles off, set up a location off campus. Now, because of Section 603, you've got grandfathered or older or original off-campus locations that were meeting all the provider-based department criteria that you've been billing for quite a while before Section 603 kicked in November 2, 2015. So those were your original off-campus locations. Newer locations after that date line in the sand, as I like to call it, would be non-accepted, potentially non-grandfathered, and subject to no longer having hospital payment, billing with a modifier PN, and we'll go through modifiers a bit more in a moment. What may or may not be known is that you can even go beyond 35 miles and have a provider-based department. There's a different test set up in the rules, and that's called the 75% test. That's meaning that inpatients that get admitted to the main campus, when needed for the patients treated at that location, 75% or more have to be admitted to the main campus. And I think there are specialty providers that could meet that possibly in spades. I just don't know that they're aware of it or work with the regional office to kind of get that classification set up.
I think they were set up for pediatric type units out in California originally, but it's designed to capture the same population. It's really not about space. It's about
Exactly. And I
So
think oncology could be one that could qualify potentially.
and there's another
Remote,
one for DISH hospitals that have a special county contract or state municipal hospitals. That's also out there. An exception to the 35-mile rule.
So the other exception is a remote location. The remote location has to have inpatient beds, not satellite. There's different definitions. So this is a remote location with inpatient beds. Because it has inpatient beds, the way I like to think about it is it gets its own 250-yard bubble around it, which is treated the same as on campus for payment purposes. The final thing I just want to mention is that I don't think people understand the definition of dedicated emergency department, because a dedicated emergency department operated by the main provider is accepted and paid 100% hospital payment by Medicare, whether on or off campus. It's typically subject to the 35-mile rule, but it's all the services at that location because the designation is by location, not by type of service. And so only one of the criteria is that only a third of the appointments or visits, and it wouldn't be an appointment by definition if it's unscheduled, urgent in nature. So about a third of the encounters at that location are urgent or of an emergent nature where they're unscheduled. The rest of it can all be scheduled. And so that's a possibility that I think hospitals should take advantage of as well.
I agree with you, Valerie. And in fact, it's interesting how that rule was developed. They actually take a look at the EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Patient Act, which was designed to protect patients who come to a hospital. And that definition is actually broad. It includes the one-third test, but it also includes facilities that are held out to the public as providing emergency services without an appointment. So there's a lot more entities that qualify, you're exactly right, as a DED than meets the eye.
Yep.
Should we
and
we talk about how to determine the, I'm sorry, go ahead, Val.
Oh, I was going to say, and I've had clients relook at that and actually do set it up that way, which enabled them to meet the exception for payment purposes. Yes, let's talk about where you measure from for your bubble.
Yeah, and we've actually got a question. We're getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A feature, and that was very much one of them. And the question that came in was, we have conflicting opinions about the 250 yards. One is from the main entrance. The other is from any brick on the wall of the existing on-campus facility. And I'll tell you that I've heard others. There's others that just 250 yards from any patient care entrance, 250 yards from the ED, 250 yards from any inpatient facility. And lots of ROs have been judging it differently. The regulation itself doesn't specifically speak to this, although it does in the context of thinking about what 250 yards of the remote location is. And that's extremely broad, really. It's from any point of the remote location. And a number of me and my colleagues think that that same principle applies through some language which we see in the preamble to determining campus for the main campus as well as remote locations. Val, do you have any opinion one way or the other on that?
Yeah, I think that the discussion in the preamble that you just mentioned when they were discussing campus for purposes of Section 603, so that would have been what, the 2016 OPPS proposed and final rules, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. That preamble discussion, I think, is the best to inform the definition and the regulations in terms of what the expectation is for the regional offices. But even though that informs it, I don't think that helps all the regional offices come into line with that discussion in the preamble, unfortunately. So it's something you're going to have to advocate for, I believe. Right.
I certainly wouldn't voluntarily take the position that it's the ER or even the patient care entrances unless your RO has specifically said it. But at the same time, there is an option to ask for a regional office determination of the main campus, which I have done in some close calls because you don't want to be in a position where you are building a new facility, which you're budgeting as if it would be under OPPS and not get it. And I think we're running a little slow on time, aren't we, Valerie?
Yep. So you want to take over the next slide, Larry?
Yeah, and I'll pick up the pace a little bit. So during the COVID era, there are some specific changes that I think are important to be aware of that extensively waive the conditions of participation. These waivers are online at CMS. They're updated from time to time, I think most recently in February. There are also some very helpful guides about the waivers available to hospitals and critical access hospitals. The most significant for purposes of this presentation is regarding relocation, which under the old rules and probably under the future-looking rules, you can't relocate an accepted off-campus department or else you'll blow your grandfathered status. We'll walk through, if time permits, what those pre and post rules are. But right now, from March 1 until the end of the public health emergency, an accepted off-campus department may relocate and not blow its status, so you would relocate a grandfathered facility. You can relocate it in part, you can divide it and subdivide it, you can leave the existing provider-based department there and create a new one. You don't need a prior approval, and you can still get full OPPS coverage. You just have to give notice to the regional office within 20 days of when you set it up. You should check carefully which of these conditions of participation and other rules are waived and track them, because you're going to want to go back when the public health emergency ends, and beware of which unwaived conditions of participation you must still be able to comply with. And in fact, the hospital is still running the show for all these departments, even if many of the services are furnished, as we say, under arrangements. So just a recap here, CMS is going to let us relocate an accepted department into multiple locations, partially while containing the old one, and also exciting, you can now relocate a PBD, a provider-based department, into the patient's home and provide outpatient hospital or even inpatient hospital services there under the so-called Hospitals Without Walls program. This can allow you to do both inpatient and, as I said, outpatient services within a temporary expansion site or a patient's home and treat that as part of the hospital. They're allowing room and board, which had never been treated as an under arrangement service for hospitals, to now be done on an under arrangements basis, which is good, as well as nursing services. Let us share with you this graphic. This is a graphic that CMS used over the summer to try to describe the different ways that hospitals can provide outpatient services in locations other than the main campus of the hospital and its own provider-based departments. If anyone's interested, we can share the entirety of the slide presentation. It was quite helpful. We've doctored it up a little bit with some notes on the side for your information. So these aren't exactly intact the way CMS created them. But this is particularly helpful as it shows CMS's view that the home is a legitimate basis for inpatient and outpatient services on a going forward basis. Probably the most dramatic of these changes was when CMS really came out of the box in the fall with the acute hospital care at home program. There are a number of health systems that were already providing services of this nature in patients' homes, but the challenge was always, do you get Medicare reimbursement as a hospital for it? And we chatted a minute ago, Valerie and I, about whether there's home health out there. Other hospitals were doing them through their affiliated physician organization. But the challenge for many hospitals was, can you meet the 24-hour nursing rule and be providing hospital services in the home? I think a lot of us believed that telemedicine would satisfy the 24/7 nursing rule, although CMS had been a bit mum on that until November of 2020, when they allow a waiver of that as well. And so as of March 19th, there were 48 health systems and 111 hospitals in 29 states around the country that took advantage of this waiver program. You have to individually apply for it. There's different waivers for experienced hospitals that were already doing hospital at home, which I think supports my position that it was okay to be doing hospital at home prior to the waiver, but I'll just leave it at that. And as well as inexperienced hospitals that hadn't been treating patients already. Do you have any reactions to those, Valerie or Paul, before we move on to our next polling question? If not, I'll turn it back to Amy for our polling question number 3.
All right, so our third polling question is a true or false. All hospital services have to be furnished in the hospital space. A, true, or B, false?
And if
This
we were
one
going
will
to
be
get tricky on
interesting.
this question, yeah, if we were going to get tricky on this, we should have had a pre- and post-COVID and diagnostic versus therapeutic services.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to throw them a curveball. I'd like to think that after I told them the answer, they should get everybody get this right.
I would hope so. Everybody's going to get it right.
I have a feeling you just steered them on that.
Somebody said that we got one comment that I was breaking up a bit, so we'll see how bad. Amy, what's the answer?
All right, it looks like most have responded.
Yay!
They were paying attention. Very good.
They've learned the key thing they're going to take away today for sure.
We will keep the pace lively as we go into the next section, but we wanted to make sure, while we were talking about the COVID era, we wanted to make sure that we covered what should be old news to most of the folks on the call today. But it sets the floor for why we care about getting these departments right and using exceptions versus non-exceptions. And that is, as you mentioned, Valerie, that under the Section 603 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, what we call Section 603 for short, that as of January 1, 2017, no off-campus outpatient department of a provider could bill under the outpatient prospective payment system unless it was a DED, as you mentioned, or it was grandfathered or accepted. And if it doesn't meet one of those rules, it's got a 60% payment reduction under OPPS. That's the alternative payment model, a 60% haircut. Note that this applies to off-campus outpatient departments. So on-campus clinics aren't covered by this. They are supposed to get, Congress wanted them to get 100% of OPPS. I emphasize that for dramatic purposes that'll make sense later. And it also applies to provider-based departments within 250 yards of a remote location, as you mentioned, a inpatient facility that's located off of the main campus of the hospital.
So Larry, real quick, because we've got questions about this, does the remote location have to be acute care beds, short-term acute care beds? Could it be psych beds, rehab beds?
I think there's a lot of flexibility for what's a remote location, so long as it's not a satellite on somebody else's campus. Is that your view as well?
I do too. Yep, that's my view as well. So I believe those types of inpatient beds do qualify.
Yep. And, again, it's worth clarifying those in writing with your regional office when you establish, we didn't talk about the attestation process, but we could. Attestation for provider-based departments under 413.65 has always been voluntary, with the exception of a mid-build point, which we can talk about in a minute. But, there are some advantages to attesting, and one of them is you get a piece of paper, a golden ticket that says you meet the rules, and it can also say you're either on campus or you're within 250 yards of a remote location, which is a very valuable piece of paper to have should someone later question your determination. Once you're accepted, though, there are risks that you could blow up your exception. And we don't know what all of those ways of blowing it up are. And compliance officers and lawyers have struggled with some of them that perhaps we'll talk about if we have time at the end. But the easiest way to blow one is to move it. And you can't, in the pre- and post-COVID environment, permanently relocate a accepted provider-based department unless you have an extraordinary circumstance. And CMS made the bar really high for that. To have an extraordinary circumstance, it has to be something beyond the hospital's control, like a natural disaster, a significant seismic building code necessity, or a significant public health or safety issue. It doesn't say if the landlord decides to jack up the rent 3 times. It doesn't say if it's not big enough for, patient care needs. Any relocation off the address that's located in the PICOS system blows up your exception. You also can't separately sell a accepted clinic. You can't trade one to another hospital in the system. You have to flip the entire provider agreement for the whole hospital. But, and this is a question that we had in the chat feature a moment ago, Someone asked, can we add new services in an accepted facility without blowing it? And the answer is yes, at least today. At least there was a proposal to limit the accepted department to only the same clinical families of services that were offered at the time the exception went into effect, which is November 2nd, 2015. But that was not finalized in the final rule. So if you have some old accepted facility where you're doing stuff you don't need, you can certainly add new services there. As you mentioned, also you can do that on the you can do that in a DED anytime you want, and everything is safe, even if you built it after 2015. One minor note, for those of you who are subject to it, there was a part of the 21st Century Cures Act addressed the situation of hospitals that were in the middle of establishing a new provider-based department when Section 603 went into effect. And Congress, in the act, allowed a very limited submission by Valentine's Day of the next year to prove that you were in the process of building this and you had a contract with an outside unrelated party for the actual construction of the department. You got a provider-based attestation in and you put it on the enrollment application. These were all supposed to have been done 2 years ago, but the decisions only were released in the twilight hours of almost the midnight hour of the administration. They all came out on January 19th, and 60% of them failed. So there were 202 dissatisfied customers out there who thought that they had a legitimate claim to be treated as accepted, and in fact they were billing because they were told they could for 2 years by CMS. And now we've got a letter which said, oh, you have to give us a check back for all that additional revenue that you collected during that period of time, and you can't be treated as accepted any longer. And to pour salt in the wounds, the statute said there's no judicial or administrative review for those determinations. If you are one of those 202 hospitals, I hope you know that, and you can request the work paper so you can see why they denied you. The most common denial that we've seen is because the construction was baked into the lease. The hospital asked the landlord to arrange for construction and get it done by a certain point of time, and the landlord would hire a contractor perhaps or even do it themselves. The auditors didn't like that and denied every one of them, as far as I can tell. So the industry is not happy with that outcome. The AHA issued a letter, I think it was yesterday, Valerie, wasn't it, or 2 days ago, arguing that by missing that deadline by 2 years, not only was it unfair, but CMS is incapable of denying their claims for that, and particularly in light of the lack of judicial or administrative review and the demand for a repayment. That's a pretty harsh result.
Exactly.
Thoughts on these pieces, Val or Paul?
Well, I think it just emphasizes what I like to call that your accepted and grandfathered space as well as your on-campus space is more precious than ever. And I also think that, especially for the mid-build piece, you need to be getting the work papers and then advocating really hard around this.
We've got a number of really good questions in the Q&A. I'll try to cover a couple of them before we move into 340B, because that's the next subject. One it goes into the topic of what does it mean to relocate, and can you increase the space in your facility? The way CMS is treating this, they're looking at the address as the magic determinant. The address that's listed on PICOS, the address that was listed on your provider-based attestation if you had it. We're seeing really careful scrutiny of these things by the regional offices and by the MACs. Within that specific address, though, there are oftentimes dead space or administrative space that wasn't covered. It wasn't historically used for clinical services. I think a lot of providers are certainly comfortable treating those new spaces, those administrative spaces, as part of the provider-based department and accept it. Knocking down walls, it's a little unclear how that works. Certainly adding, going into a new suite would be one that would be deemed to be a relocation by CMS anyway. But one of the things, as you mentioned, Valerie, is people are repurposing stuff on campus, we're also repurposing stuff off campus. If there's provider-based departments that are kind of underutilized, and that's a good area for community service and community need, we're certainly doing stuff there. Places like rehab centers off campus pose an interesting dilemma because they don't oftentimes bill under OPPS. Though there are a few claims and there are a few OPPS services that happen in PT centers at hospitals. And so, in my view, if you've got one of those claims billed under OPPS before 2015, you are accepted. So that's a careful one to look at. Was that where you were going to go to, Val?
Oh yeah, rehab I feel like is absolutely a potential to relocate wherever you want to relocate them because they're not subject to provider-based rules. And if that location was claimed on your 855 enrollment and everything prior to that date line in the sand, I believe it's open to relocate OPPS type services. And then Larry's saying to kind of like prove it, you would have at least one claim payable prior to that under OPPS for OPPS type services. But I think rehab is definitely an option, and so is diabetes self-management education and nutrition, medical nutrition therapy. If those locations of services are accepted, you can use that space if that was already accepted. So first, and move them out. So
a related question we see in the okay. Sorry,
Larry, I was just going to say, Valerie, I think that's such a critical point, and I know we addressed it earlier, but really talking about the difference between facility services that are outpatient or ancillary, those that are therapeutic, those that are diagnostic, and then your administrative overhead. And especially if you're in a metro market, really looking at where those services are located relative to where core services are located, knowing that patients who are arriving for PT as follow-up from an orthopedic procedure or those types of items, where's the best clinical pathway and where is that threshold where if something is too far or in a different location, is that preventative psychologically for patients to get to those appointments and follow-up because there's a lot of unintentional cost that's incurred because of patients not getting medication or follow-up or things like that. So in addition to everything else that we've covered from a compliance and billing perspective, there's the operations and clinical pathway perspective that everyone has to keep in mind as well. So that way that dialogue between revenue cycle, payer contracting, operations, clinical leadership, everyone has to be on the same page because there's so many spokes on the wheel.
Great point.
Absolutely correct. Great point. So let's briefly touch on 340B. It's one of the key reasons why hospitals may want to open certain outpatient hospital departments that have a fair degree of outpatient administered or prescribed medications. Now, it used to be that Medicare paid all drugs, outpatient covered separately paid drugs at ASP plus 6%. But in 2018, they did invoke a policy that for those hospitals participating in a 340B program, they would have to self-disclose the non-pass-through separately paid outpatient drugs. Those are drugs with status indicator K under the OPPS program. Self-disclose that they have purchased it at a 340B discount with modifier JG, and that subjected the payment rate to a discount of ASP minus 22.5%, so almost a 30% swing in reimbursement. That was not applicable to non-accepted sites in 2018, and there were a lot of questions that hospitals said, oh, was that intentional or not? And CMS said, nope, that's correct, it doesn't apply, but then the very next year in 2019, they then made it apply to the non-accepted locations as well. So this is one of the policies that is under litigation. AHA and hospitals sued CMS. The court ruled in the favor of AHA, but then CMS appealed, and the district court reversed. And it is now, I believe, part of a consolidated court case along with the other site-neutral payment policy that's been filed with the Supreme Court. And I don't think we've heard whether the Supreme Court has taken it or not. So what was that other site neutrality issue? Well, CMS cherry-picked the most frequent outpatient hospital service, which is an outpatient hospital visit code, GO463, and they said even if it's in a grandfathered accepted location, they're going to subject that to the same 60% payment reduction, but not because of Section 603, but rather because we've seen, meaning CMS has seen, what they called an unnecessary volume increase of those services. Now, I feel like that's a bit of sophistry because CMS has been, over the years, putting status indicator B on a lot of valid CPT codes that hospitals perform in a hospital departments. And status indicator B means there's an alternate code. Oftentimes, the only alternate code to bill when the service is covered and medically necessary is the G code. So it's forcing more and more outpatient hospital services to be billed with this generic G code. And then more and more of those services have been done in outpatient hospital campuses for various reasons over the years. And so then CMS says there's been an unnecessary increase. That was also part of a court case. And similar situation, except that the court, when they ruled in favor of the hospitals and AHA, mandated that CMS repay. So CMS had to repay those claims at the end of 2019. Then the district court overturned it and ruled in CMS's favor. And then CMS has initiated reprocessing of those claims to make the reduction again applicable for the 2019 claims. AHA has also filed with the Supreme Court for this case. So my understanding is that they combined both into one case that they're trying to get the Supreme Court to take. And I don't think we've heard yet that the Supreme Court has taken it. How are the payment reductions applied? Well, it's, Larry, did you want to comment?
No, let's go.
Okay.
We're good.
How are the payment reductions applied? Well, they're triggered by the application of modifiers. And this is where I was saying the billing department really needs to know physical location by physical location. Has it been deemed on, off campus, accepted, non-accepted? Is it an OPPS payable service or not? There's a lot of questions around this. But there are no modifiers on outpatient hospital procedure codes if it's the service, the location of the service is in the main hospital or on an on-campus provider-based department, including locations within 250 yards of a remote location building. No modifier applied. Then, if they're older, original, off-campus provider-based departments or accepted departments, modifier PO is applied. And the only trigger of a payment reduction there is with that GO463 when billed with PO, that triggers that 60% reduction. And for newer off-campus locations that are non-accepted, non-payable under OPPS, they are paid under a site-specific form of the physician fee schedule, which is defined as 40% of the OPPS rates. Then we mentioned that dedicated emergency department exception, 100% of OPPS rates apply there, including the outpatient hospital visit code GO463, and the modifier to use there is ER. Options to mitigate payment. So this is where we've already kind of been mentioning this. You want to move out any non-hospital or administrative services from on or accepted off-campus locations that you've already had enrolled on your 855. You want to vacate them and use them for clinical services as much as you can. Then you want to look at locations that have been performing therapy or diabetes and nutrition therapy. Those are hospital services that are not billable and payable under OPPS. They're payable under the physician fee schedule, even though the hospital is billing for them. And as such, they're not subject to the provider-based department rules. They can be in any kind of space, still subject to your state requirements, but not to the Medicare provider-based requirements. And so you can move them out and use that space as long as it's on your 855 enrollment. If you do have to relocate, the exception is extraordinary circumstances. Think seismic code, think some kind of natural disaster. where it's a temporary relocation. If it's a permanent relocation, it really has to be for something, that they really aren't allowing permanent relocation. It's really for a temporary relocation. Then if you're considering to new locations, you're growing in your market area and you need to define new locations, can that new location qualify as a DED? Is it appropriate to put urgent care type services at that location? Do you need a new location really for diagnostic services? So a lot of people don't realize that you can have an arrangement with an entity to furnish the diagnostic services under arrangement to your hospital outpatients. And under arrangement, diagnostic services are not subject to the provider-based department rules and are billed as if they were performed in the main hospital and paid 100% OPPS. It's another nuance that I think is often missed by hospitals.
A lot of people miss that. Yep.
Yep. And one thing people don't realize is even today, before the pandemic, all this stuff, diagnostic services are not required to be performed in hospital space to be covered. They can be performed in homes. You can send your flubs into the home. You can send other staff for Part B only services like vaccines into homes and still bill it as the hospital as long as other coverage criteria are met. So it's something important to consider. So Larry, talk to us about
don't forget that we also have, and we should also remember that for this new location, if the new location is within 250 yards of a remote location, it's also going to be protected from the site neutrality payment reductions. And there are a number of questions in the chat feature about that, so there's a lot of interest there. In fact, we're starting to see hospitals that have been looking at creating, you remember the debates around micro-hospitals a couple of years ago, which were sort of standalone hospitals that were super small with only a little bit of inpatient capacity, and CMS wasn't too happy about them and established some rules on them. But it's not a micro-hospital if it's a remote location of your main hospital. And so, in my view, none of the micro-hospital principles should apply to that. And there are certainly opportunities to have inpatient capacity in those other areas and then create that. Yeah, let's briefly cover some of the shared space issues. I think we're still in a bit of a holding pattern for that. You may recall that, in 2011, CMS's Region 5 regional office issued a letter rejecting a provider-based determination of I think it was a radiology facility where a hospital and a physician group shared some space, and they said you can't do that. You have to be hospital space all the time. And a couple of years later, they started training the regional offices, the survey agencies, and the accrediting agencies on a pretty strict definition of the shared space prohibition, which basically said you can't share space with other freestanding entities in your clinical locations. A couple of years ago, before the zombie apocalypse changed everything, there was some draft guidance issued that I thought was pretty material and recognized that there are some benefits to having a single building where some freestanding physician offices, hospital space, other hospitals could collaborate and work together, so long as the clinical space of those those enterprises weren't commingled, but allowed sharing of certain common space, sharing of certain staff, sharing of certain waiting rooms, which was, I thought, a welcomed change. That guidance still hasn't been finalized, to my knowledge. Still hasn't been finalized yet, but we'll see where they come out. We were promised that there would be something early in this year, and I'm still sort of hopeful that it comes out. They were leaning in the right direction. And the gestalt here is, I still don't think that CMS is saying you can share clinical space within a hospital and some third party, but you can share a lot of things that were going to be expensive to have to do and stupid to have to duplicate within an organization. They also expanded in this guidance to talk about when you can share staff, and really what they didn't want to see is a individual nurse or other patient care professional, other than physicians, floating between two enterprises, the hospital and somebody else, during the same shift. But it wouldn't be a problem if you had somebody doing shift one in one facility and shift two in another. And the reason is they don't want people to be distracted. If there's a crash or a code in the hospital, they don't want to have to look around and find that everybody's working over in the physician office across the hall. Have you, Paul or Valerie, had any other questions on co-location before we move on to some of our next topics?
Yeah, I think the biggest question is when you've got a community hospital and then you have a teaching hospital, distant, and specialists come to the community hospital like once a month and run a specialty clinic, and those physicians are out of the hospital space, and those physicians are billing place of service 11. They're billing the prophy as if it were their office.
And I think that's a no-no. I think they have to bill all Medicare patients the same in a hospital. So there'll always have to be a split bill, and the physicians will always have to treat that space as a outpatient hospital space. I don't have any problem with the physicians from the teaching hospital coming over and running that clinic as long as they bill it as a hospital outpatient department. And what you can't do is have the teaching hospital bill the outpatient service there.
Yep. I think it's an issue that just isn't well understood.
The trickier issue is that they also have offered those teaching physicians private office space in the hospital, which they might want to keep some days a week or all the time. And that's been a challenge under the old school looking at co-location. The new draft rule, I think, allows a little more of that, so long as the patients don't have to traverse hospital clinical space to get to those private offices. And in those private offices that are dedicated private offices and not split with the hospital, it is okay to bill place of service 11. Again, so long as you don't trigger whatever CMS ultimately concludes is its co-location guidance. So let's try to wrap up in a few more minutes, shall we? Paul, I'm sorry that Valerie and I talked so much on the first part of our discussion.
Oh, Larry, so critically important to cover those items from both a compliance and billing, legality, all of those important considerations. What I'd like to do, I know we only have 3 minutes left. I'm actually going to jump ahead, Amy, to our final polling question so that we can capture that within the hour, and then I'll close with some color commentary on the cost report itself.
Perfect. So the last polling question is it okay to split bill Medicare patients only? A, yes, B, no, or C, let me consult with a lawyer. And I'll use this time to let you know that once you have met all CPE requirements, you can download your certificate from the CPE progress window. And if you have any difficulty downloading it now, it will be emailed out within a couple weeks.
I gave him this answer a minute ago, too, didn't I?
Okay, here you go.
Well, interesting. They came up with a interesting split here. The answer is it is okay to only bill Medicare patients with a split bill. That was a piece of the original revisions to the provider-based rules back in 2000 because they recognized that some commercial payers can't process a split bill. They require a global bill. So that's an interesting split there. Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some considerations here up on the screen, especially for the critical access folks who may be on the line. When we see a lot of split bill questions come up, one of the important considerations to remember is when you're split billing and you have that UB04 and the 1500, or you global bill only on the 1500, make sure that the sum of the charges between the two are consistent. And I know that comes up quite a bit when folks go through system conversions, is making sure that if you have a 510 and a 97 or a 98X revenue code where you're split billing clinic services, and then you move over to the 1500 and you have a 99213 or 99214 or another HCPCS code on there, you have to make sure that those are in parity. And Valerie, I know you and I have talked about that quite a bit, and you've navigated some pitfalls for folks in that area.
Absolutely. The math really matters, and how you handle it in your general ledger really matters, as Paul described. So it can be done. The other thing I think is interesting is, talking with the payers about still reporting on the 1500 and outpatient hospital place of service code if that's what the location is, because of HIPAA transaction sets. So that's another aspect.
Absolutely. And as Larry mentioned, we received so many great questions in our Q&A chat window. I know we're at the end of our time here. We are more than happy to follow up on anything billing or cost report related with you after the presentation. I know throughout, certainly in the slides, talking about the impact of UBO for facility billing versus the pro fees, where those locations matter, and then as Valerie mentioned, place of service, critically important when we're talking about provider-based designations and on and off campus. But we really appreciate everyone dialing in today. It looks like we had almost 300 plus attendees, so certainly an important topic. Larry and Valerie, I'll pass it back to you to close out, and then I know Amy has some closing comments as well.
Well, I'll just say thank you all, and thank my friend and colleague Andy Ruskin, who contributed some of these slides along the way. This was a good time. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, same here. Thanks, everyone, and go forth and try to figure it out.
All right. Well, thank you, Valerie, Larry, and Paul, for a great presentation today, and to the audience for your participation. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. And here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey, as your feedback is very important to us. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time.